Hey Ecofictologists, my name is Lovis and today I'm doing the first book review of 2021, and for that I have chosen The Tangled Lands by Paolo Bacigalupi and Tobias Buckell. Last week's episode was an introduction to ecofantasy, how broad that category can be and the power it can have in reaching a wide audience. I briefly mentioned The Tangled Lands as an example of secondary world high ecofantasy, and I really wanted to go into more detail on it because I think it's a great example, so I figured why not do a whole episode. The Tangled Lands is actually a collection of four novellas / short stories, two of them written by Tobias Buckell and two written by Paolo Bacigalupi. The four stories are set in the same world, the crumbling empire of Jhandpara, but they feature different protagonists, so they're linked and strands of each story kind of filter into the next ones, but they can be read as standalones. The four stories are called The Alchemist, The Executionist, The Children of Kaim, and The Blacksmiths Daughter. The first two, The Alchemist and The Executionist, were published before separately as novellas, kind of a world-building collaboration between the two authors, and then they were joined by the other two stories when they made the Tangled Lands collection. I will be talking about each story individually as well as the world that they are set in. This is a high fantasy story, but I think it sends some really strong messages about how we as a society use power irresponsibly. So get comfortable and we'll get right into it. This is the first book review where I'm not going to start with a spoiler-free summary because they are four separate stories, so summarizing them all briefly would be kind of tricky, and then jumping around like that might be a little confusing, so I'm going to say everything I need to say about each one in turn. But first I want to introduce the world that this is all set in, the Jhandpara Empire. This is a secondary world and it has magic, but here magic has a cost. It seeds a horrible weed called bramble, which is fast-growing, all-consuming, difficult to get rid of because of all the little hairs and seeds that it expels, and it sends people into kind of an eternal sleep if it touches their skin, and they never wake up from this sleep. The more people used magic, the faster this weed grew until eventually it took over cities and kingdoms, forcing people into neighboring lands as refugees. The use of magic has been curbed and is punishable by death. The only one who can legally use it is the official mage of Kaim. But bramble is still growing, so someone is still secretly using magic, and this is where our stories start. A few environmental messages from the world building before we even get into the plots of our stories. The people of the Jhandpara Empire saw the potentially devastating effects of magic use and the resulting bramble, but they saw it, oh, it's so far in the future, it can't possibly affect me, someone surely will find a solution. Does that sound familiar? It should. The fact that magic here represents the technology that is causing environmental destruction, I think is really powerful because magic is one of those things that makes your life easier. So it's a question of convenience, and that is something that we as a society really struggle with. We might talk about how horrible the environmental damage is that we're seeing, but we really struggle to choose a lifestyle that might require more effort, even if we know that the most convenient thing might also be the most harmful thing. We all think, just this once, it's not going to make a difference. But if everybody thinks that, then as a population, it does definitely make a difference. So that's kind of the base environmental message of the setting itself, and now we can move on to the stories. So, first up is The Alchemist by Paolo Bacigalupi. This novella focuses on an alchemist, shocker, who tries to find a non-magical solution to bramble. He uses his scientific knowledge to invent a contraption that destroys bramble effectively. So it burns the roots to nothing, it leaves no hairs, nothing to regrow. Unfortunately, as with many scientific discoveries in our history, what it's designed for is not necessarily what it is used for, especially if its intended use threatens the power of currently very powerful people. The main thing I want to talk about with this story is the idea that even if solutions to our problems exist, if implementing those solutions doesn't benefit the people who are currently profiting from the way things are now, then those inventions or scientific discoveries might be discarded or warped to a completely different use. Even with so much destruction, there is someone who is profiting, and profit or influence are very powerful motivations. Next up is The Executionist by Tobias Buckell. This story features Tana, the daughter of the town executioner, who, through a series of events, ends up having to wield her father's axe. The Pikins are a religious fanatic group who raid towns and cities, attacking the people that they believe are responsible for bringing destruction down on everybody in the form of bramble, and stealing children in order to convert them to their way of thinking. When Tana's children are taken, she gets kind of swept up in the growing movement of resistance against the Pikins, and the legend of the Executionist spreads. This story is more about the knock-on effects of magic. Environmental destruction, the displacement of people, the poor and downtrodden feeling the brunt of the crisis. This is always going to breed violence and unrest, as people have to go to more and more drastic measures to survive. So that is the first half, the 2 paired novellas that were published before this collection was made. If that half focused on the environmental destruction, then the second half focuses on the social injustice that is caused by that environmental destruction. The third story, The Children of Kaim by Paolo Bacigalupi, is told from the perspective of one of the many refugees who has had to flee from cities or kingdoms that have been overrun by bramble. Mop is a child who works in the bramble fields collecting bramble seed pods before they can burst and release all of their spores. This is very dangerous work because if the bramble hairs touch your skin, you go into bramble sleep, which no one wakes from. I won't go into too much detail about this one because in true Paolo Bacigalupi fashion, it is absolutely sickening. It focuses on how dark and depraved human nature is, and it really just made me need a shower. Ugh. But the message I want to highlight is that the most dangerous work is given to the refugees, among them children. They've been hit the hardest by the crisis, but they're still sent to the front lines to do the dirty work because it's the only job that they can get, and no one cares if they fall into bramble sleep. The last story, The Blacksmiths Daughter by Tobias Buckell, focuses on a blacksmithing family who are commissioned to make a certain suit of armor for a duke, the promised price of which would save them from starvation. But of course, things don't go their way, and the Duke tries to take advantage of their poverty and his social standing to swindle them. One thing leads to another, and the blacksmith's daughter ends up having to find her strength to get herself out of a really bad situation. It showcases the exploitation of the poor with really no other options by the rich who are still using magic freely, but are wealthy or influential enough to cover it up. I think the fact that the 4 stories in the Tangled Lands explores the link between environmental destruction and social injustice is really powerful, and it's a really important perspective to highlight. So many people don't see the link between these 2 things in our real world, even though it is all around us. But it is difficult to ignore when you read books like these. None of the protagonists would have been in the horrible, grief-stricken situations that they were put in without the careless and excessive use of power by the general populace that led to bramble. And it solidly points the finger at those small, everyday little magics that people think, oh, it's so small, it's such a small thing, it won't make any difference. But again, as a population, it does make a difference. Everyone has contributed to the current state of the world. So what do we have here? We have a high fantasy setting and strong environmental messaging. It can be done! I hope you have enjoyed this review of The Tangled Lands by Tobias Buckell and Paolo Bacigalupi. If you have, remember to like the video and let me know down in the comments below. And of course, subscribe to my channel and ring that bell so you get notified every time I post new content weekly. If you like what I do and want to support me, then head on over to patreon.com/ecofictology and become a patron. Your patronage not only buys me my next book, but it also supports Love the Oceans, a marine conservation organization operating out of Mozambique. If you like hearing about ecofiction in all its forms, why not join the Rewilding Our Stories Discord server run by me and Mary Woodbury from Dragonfly Eco, where we have created a little community of ecofiction lovers. It's a safe space to discuss anything you like and to share resources. If Discord isn't really your thing, there is now an Ecofictology Facebook group that you can join. I will be posting resources and updates there as well, and I invite you to post any questions that you have to get some discussion going. The link is in the description below. Well, that's it from me, so I'll see you next week, Ecofictologists.